Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Green Earth podcast by DGB Group. I'm Pedro Zimmer, your host, and in today's episode, we're joined by Tom Hills from SCB Group. It was a very interesting conversation in which we explored the exciting growth and opportunities in the carbon market. But before we begin, I'd like to remind you that the Green Earth podcast is a DGB Group initiative. DGB is a large-scale nature-based project developer, and our goal is to help nature flourish and prosper. If you want to read more about our projects, please check our website, green.earth. The link is also in the description. But now, with no further ado, here's my conversation with Tom Hills. Well, starting off, Thomas, first of all, thank you so much for being here. It's a pleasure to talk to you. I'd like to first ask for you to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do and where you do it.
Good morning, Pedro. Thank you very much for having me this morning on your podcast. I look forward to talking with you. So my name's Tom Hills. I work for SCB Group, based here in London. Our company dates back to 2007. We're involved across environmental markets, based out of an office in headquarters in Nyon in Switzerland. We also have offices in Chicago, Puerto Rico, and Singapore. From London, I work on our voluntary carbon desk, primarily working with corporate clients, assisting them with climate solutions. To that end, we manage a portfolio of carbon offsets that we have built up over a number of years, working very closely with project developers as off-takers of credits from their projects, as project financiers to a number of those projects, in particular in community-based and nature-based projects where we have considerable expertise. We have funded over the years a number of those projects, particularly clean cooking projects, clean cookstove projects, and clean water projects in LDCs. So with a focus on sub-Saharan Africa, also South Asia, and where both we're looking at this from a commercial standpoint, but also very much looking at the impact those projects can have on the ground in terms of climate impact and more broadly the social impact some of those projects can have, where we see there is a lot of value, and we take pride in being involved in those projects and the impact they can have on communities. So my personal involvement in the company is helping to lead our sales effort and working with those corporates, also taking part in a considerable amount of the origination, working with project developers. And we have a number of particularly close relationships where we may work on an exclusive basis with a project developer. We may be marketing credits on their behalf. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea. In terms of our business as a whole, in 2024, we transacted about 6.7 million tons of carbon offsets for retirement. So that's sales to corporates who are offsetting their emissions, which is a number we're quite pleased with and quite proud of. That tends to be in the mid-tier of corporates as a sweet spot for us, where we're focusing very much on those corporates it's a very big mid-tier. It's across different industry segments, from fast-moving consumer goods to industrials, to airlines, to more local businesses that are looking to make a climate contribution. And our average transaction size is in the low thousands. We do a lot of transactions in 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 tons. And averaging perhaps 12,000 tons. Obviously, there are larger clients who have more significant carbon footprints that they need to address. So that's hopefully gives you a bit of a flavor as to what we do.
Amazing. So yeah, Tom, that definitely gives me a great overview of what you do and what your company does. Can you tell me, how did you get into this market? What got you interested in the carbon and sustainability market?
Me personally, it actually goes back quite a long way. So I have spent most of my career in finance, in markets, and particularly in commodities markets. Going back 4 or 5 years, I saw that SCB were getting involved in the carbon space. I have known SCB since more or less they began, and in fact, when I was back in my days as I was involved in soft commodities, particularly sugar, also ethanol, I was actually a client of SCB, so I learned more about what they were doing and had kept in touch. I did many years ago, 20 years ago, in fact, I did a master's in development here in London at the London School of Economics, and I've always had an interest in the impact in what I'm doing. And I saw that as the carbon markets were evolving, it was an exciting space to get into. It's an area where I think we need to bring the tools of commerce, and we need, in order for carbon markets to work, we need markets. We need a cross section where there's an opportunity for businesses to make a return on their investment while having impact on the ground. And I found that very exciting. Today we are helping a wide range of corporate clients to achieve their objectives while helping them direct some of their funds to very, very worthwhile projects, primarily in the developing world, not exclusively. And those projects are of very different types. Some maybe somewhat more generic. Others have tremendous amounts of additionality, and the contribution that the company makes will depend on the budget it has. Some companies have get closer to the projects that they decide to support than others. I have found it particularly interesting, the opportunity when I joined SCB, the opportunity also to get involved in working very closely with project developers on the ground, visiting. I've been lucky enough to travel to Rwanda, also recently to Ethiopia, and see how these projects are being implemented, and see all of that firsthand. That's on a personal level, it's been a great experience, but I think what we're doing is contributing to on a developmental level, and I think that's fantastic.
That's amazing to hear. And if you don't mind, could you tell me a little bit about these these trips to both Rwanda and Ethiopia? What was your view when you got there? What did you see that was interesting? And I've personally never been to Africa, and is definitely on my bucket list, especially to visit the DGB projects in Kenya and Uganda. But being from the south of Brazil, I have absolutely no idea what's life like there. I could only tell from movies and social media. So how's life like there? What did you see that was interesting, and what kind of impacts could you see that these projects were actually making there?
So I had limited experience in Africa before, and I certainly don't profess to have tremendous experience now, but a little bit more than before. I had been to Kenya a couple of times in the past. The two experiences I had were very different. Rwanda is something of a darling of the development community. Now, there are certain, perhaps, so some may take issue with some of the democratic, the approach to democracy there, but equally, this is a country that has come from the most horrendous genocide just 30 years ago to a country that is an example to many others in Africa in many respects. So that was the first trip I made. That was back in late 2022. It was very insightful. I was very, very impressed by the country. Arriving in Kigali, the capital, it is the infrastructure that is really quite startlingly impressive. Society is somewhat regimented, but it's a very effective model, and it has allowed them to bring a cohesion to society where you had two different ethnic groups completely at each other's throats, very literally. So at a higher level, I was very impressed with what I saw in that country. The project development partner that we work with there also has many years of experience on the ground in that country, in Rwanda. And we were very impressed also with how we saw stoves. In that particular case, it was clean cook stoves being distributed, being utilised. How that project developer was monitoring the ongoing usage of those stoves, educating communities, getting the communities to buy into the concept and understanding the level of engagement that was required at government level to ensure that it had the necessary support from all levels of administration. I think a few things that struck me were how deforested the country is. It's a small country with a fairly large population, and deforested. There is agriculture everywhere. Almost every corner seemed to be cultivated largely in small holdings. There is still tremendous poverty, both rural and urban, but the poverty levels obviously differing quite a bit in different parts of the country and in Africa as a whole. My only previous experience, probably that I could put a parallel on, was I spent quite a bit of time in Central America through the 2010s, particularly in Nicaragua, and saw a lot of rural poverty there. I was involved in a coffee operation, and had also my first experience of cookstoves going back nearly 10 years. And the impact that I saw there of women in the community, healthcare issues. In that particular case, it's a slightly different example, but seeing the amount of smoke that people were exposed to in kitchens, and people, it was primarily women that were doing the cooking, would be up at 3:30, 4 in the morning in fairly horrendous conditions. That it was clearly not good for their health. You could barely keep your eyes open in there. And you'd have children running around collecting firewood. And that was my first experience outside of these two visits to Africa. And I think we saw very much a similar picture in Rwanda of how a fairly simple solution by providing it's sometimes termed a rocket stove, or in this case it was a metal stove. Now there are different stoves being delivered in different regions, adapting to different cultural requirements, different cooking requirements. But moving from the old 3-stone fire, often inside, very, very smoky, using quite a lot of firewood, and going constantly boiling water just to have clean water, of which often it may be unavailable. So you had massive impact on the women in the community, on children, potentially their access to education. They could spend more time playing or with their books or going to school instead of out foraging for firewood, freeing up a significant amount of the women's time in the community as well, a very, very significant amount, and therefore giving potential opportunities for them to engage in other economic activities, potentially providing them with more independence, and then basic matters of healthcare and sanitation. So Rwanda was a first visit, I would say. With hindsight, there were probably many things I didn't know the questions to ask yet. We learned a great deal from it. That's a project that is still ongoing. Is a project also that now is potentially going to be in line for CORSIA eligibility for the airlines compliance program. So it's particularly interesting. Moving on to Ethiopia, that was a more recent trip, just in November last year. And a very, very different setting, a much, much larger country, actually a greater degree of government engagement in order to implement projects, more ministries involved. During our week there, I think we were introduced to 4 different ministries that all had some involvement in what was happening on the ground, as well as then local level of administrations. We went to the south of Ethiopia, a city called Arba Minch. I was struck by a greater level of poverty there than I had seen in Rwanda. Dirty water running along the sides of roads. Small children without footwear, exposed to tremendous fumes. The day we arrived in Arba Minch, I think the wind, there wasn't a lot of wind that day, and later it cleared. But the smoke from everyone's little fires that were burning in their houses was quite extraordinary, and no doubt local industry as well. And of course, we also have polluted cities, but it was something that really, really struck me. It's a bigger country, so far harder to implement programs. There's further to travel to get to communities. We saw a village there which was being introduced to cookstoves for the first time. We saw how our project development partner on the ground there was working incredibly closely with community leaders, and in the village we went to, we saw how the children in the school were being taught about how this could be beneficial for them, for their families. And it was extraordinary. We saw how the children had been coached to do various songs and performances in front of the adults to help the adults to understand what the benefits were. So that was very impressive indeed. We saw another village where stoves had already been introduced. We saw that in that country, and that region of that country, each household needed 2 stoves. They have they're also preparing a type of bread that is fundamental to local cuisine. So they always needed to have two stoves on the go instead of one. So an entirely different setup. And I think whereas I had previously sometimes seen stoves that were maybe made out of clay or what appeared to be more rudimentary, actually understanding that in certain settings this was more appropriate than a metal mobile stove. We understood the different dynamics of why in one country perhaps it made sense to give stoves to villages in the community, in another where there would be a micro loans or microfinance system in place. But it was important that each household had purchased the stove even at the subsidized costs. So both fascinating experiences, and it gave us a tremendous ability, and both us and myself and my colleagues and our team here, the ability to talk in great detail to our clients, to bring to life the impact of what they are doing when they're buying a carbon offset from that project, and how they are effectively making those projects happen.
I think this is just fascinating because at first, how different some things really are. When you think about a cook stove, you think that's something quite basic, fundamental of everyone's cuisines. But if we do look at these places, that it really makes a huge difference. That it's fundamental to it's kind of a stepping stone to start developing. Because as you said, instead of spending 3-4 hours gathering firewood, you get to spend those 3-4 hours doing something a little bit more productive. But at the same time, I find it really, really interesting how similar it also is in other aspects. You mentioned the kids learn in school how to use the stoves, and doing songs and dances to teach their parents how to do so. At the same time, I remember that I did the exact same thing. I don't know how things are in England or other parts of the world, but I remember when I was young here in Brazil, I learned about recycling in school, and it was me and my little sister that plucked my mom so hard about recycling that we actually started recycling into our household. Um, and I just find it amazing how similar, how it's essentially the same thing, of course, with different literal actions, but there are concepts that apply everywhere, and I find this extremely interesting.
It's an interesting parallel. We also, sorry to just add, we saw the importance of combining different elements of cook stoves, of clean water. If you don't have clean water, you've got to boil it, or you've got to find some way of filtering it, or making sure without clean water, there is a very bad situation. And you can see that there's also a benefit of when we visited villages where, in Ethiopia particularly, where a borehole had been renovated or rehabilitated. So yes, there was clean water. So that also, they still needed the cook stove. Obviously, they still got to cook, but they didn't need to cook near or use nearly as much firewood, because they're not boiling just in order to have clean water. And actually, I think this also fits with some of DGB's projects in Ethiopia. We saw similarly, where there's a combination between clean cook stoves, clean water, and an afforestation project, where so the community's understanding actually how to manage the trees that are around them, the biodiversity and nature, and actually the importance of not felling those trees, perhaps thinning, perhaps removing certain limbs, crown lifting trees. You see quite changes in behaviour as you understand that for the new stove, you can't put a great big log in. It's only suitable for smaller pieces of wood. So this actually means that people are crown lifting a tree, so taking the lower branches off, but not killing the tree, not chopping it down. So there's a whole host of really positive impacts.
Yeah, and I find it amazing how incredibly complex this is, because at first when you think about it, it seems like it's any carbon project at first when you look at it seems like something quite simple and straightforward, like build some stoves and people stop using just regular firewood or plant some trees and that's it. But it's actually a lot more what you mentioned. I think it's what really makes these projects what we call high quality carbon projects, because they look at the situation as a whole and not just as this one issue, which is carbon that we want to fix. The issue is actually by addressing carbon, we need to address a bunch of other things that come together in this whole situation.
It's a very rewarding aspect of being involved in this space.
Definitely, definitely. So now talking a little bit about the other side of things, we know the benefits that these projects bring to the local communities and to the places that these projects are being implemented. Now, in the other side of the transaction, the companies that are looking for projects to invest, they are looking for carbon offsets to purchase. We've seen that lately. We've had a bunch of news and quite a bit of ups and downs in the market with the voluntary market. Kind of a lot of companies sort of being very conservative in their approach to compensation, and some companies changing those objectives entirely. My question to you is, what's the current outlook of the market? Since that you're on the side of actually talking to these companies all the time, what is the field? What are people looking for? In other words, how's business?
I think that the voluntary carbon market is certainly here to stay. I think we are getting through what has been a challenging time, but it's been challenging in some ways for good reason. It is always healthy for scrutiny to be applied. Now, we can argue at times whether perhaps that scrutiny has gone too far, whether people have other drivers behind what they're saying or trying to achieve. But fundamentally, the methodologies that are used for carbon markets have continued to evolve since the days of the Clean Development Mechanism. And today we see the major registries, the likes of Gold Standard, Vera, continuing to upgrade and enhance their methodologies. And some of the scrutiny that has been applied has found one or two cases, maybe more than one or two, that found a number of cases where perhaps project developers got something wrong. Perhaps there were one or two bad actors in the space who saw opportunity to make a quick buck. But for the most part, most project developers that we engage in are there very much for the right reasons. They see, as do we, that this is a process of a constant improvement. If we do nothing in the pursuit of perfection, well, we don't get anywhere at all. So we've got to try and do something. There will be mistakes made en route. I think the fact that we are seeing Vera released a new methodology back in October for sitting on the cookstove theme of VM0050 to replace the old VMR 0006. Gold Standard is moving towards the I'm forgetting it's TPD Tech version 4. Not many projects are onto that yet. It's new. It changes baselines. It changes the thresholds for things like the fraction of non-renewable biomass, and we see similar on the forestry side of new improved methodologies. So we're getting better, and we're going to continue to get better. What we are working on, the methodology we're going to apply now and today, I'm sure that in 5 to 10 years we can have better still, better ways of gauging how much carbon really was either avoided from being emitted, so it wasn't or was removed from the atmosphere. So these, I think that we are, as a market as a whole, we are taking on board a lot of the comments and criticisms that have been made, doing our best to address those. A lot of the time, you take those registries, they're NGOs, and they're not necessarily fully equipped or resourced to cope with quite so much or quite so many challenges. But as a space, we are recognizing that there were some imperfections and driving forward. So I think in terms of the market situation overall, the last year or two has been somewhat challenging for many. Everyone has learned many lessons. We have to learn by doing to a large degree, and I think we come out in a healthier situation. Certain participants perhaps are no longer involved, but many others are in a better place because they've been through that learning and can implement better projects going forward. And I think that starts to give more confidence to end customers. depending on the project type, there's probably a lag as to when that project type became under criticism to when it recovers and can address that. But Red Plus in particular was under massive pressure back in 2022, 2023 from some of that press scrutiny. And we're moving to new methodologies. I think a lot of the older projects, perhaps we don't see those again. We see new projects, we see better projects. This gives this gives corporates more confidence. They say, yeah, okay. And we see certainly see corporate clients becoming more and more sophisticated, wanting to go into greater depth, understanding they need to know exactly what they are buying, what type of projects they're getting involved in. And we are getting to the point, in my view, where we've seen the price dynamics have been very challenging for everyone on the project development side, and many projects have been under significant price pressure. Part of that's been because we saw something of an inflated price situation back in 2021. There's a lot of people come into the space and invest quickly, trying to ramp up production, if you will, of the carbon credits, and sometimes that wasn't particularly advisable. And I think we're working through that. I think we're now getting to the point where a range of project types and certain individual projects, for the first time in a couple of years, we're starting to see prices possibly even tick slightly upwards. Now, I wouldn't say that's generally the case across the whole market, but the market became very, very fragmented from going back to 2021, where people had an idea that we would be trading a ton of carbon, and a ton of carbon was a ton of carbon, didn't matter where it came from. They aren't the same, or the projects aren't the same, is what the market has decided. And for sure, we will see a lot of the projects on older methodologies, perhaps those with more questionable additionality. Yeah, I don't think there's much scope for those to see greater value. But those projects don't have that much longevity or a big role probably in the future of the market. There's a big shift towards nature-based removals, towards better quality or more rigorous methodologies and standards. And I think we're starting to see that confidence come back into the market. And for sure, we see a number of corporates step out from time to time, but from where we sit, we continue to see a very steady flow of corporate clients wanting to engage in the space, recognizing that they have a target they set for themselves of 2030 or 2035, whatever it might be, but that's getting nearer. It's actually getting very, very near. And they're often recognizing that there's only so much they can do within their own supply chains, their own processes, their own value chains. And they might well need to engage in offsetting some residual emissions that they're not otherwise able to avoid or abate. So I think I don't think 2025 is going to be necessarily a year where the market changes very dramatically, but I think we've got through a lot of challenges and we're heading to a more positive space and a better quality market. Sorry, I've gone on a little bit there, but I hope that makes some sense.
That does. Is it investing advice?
I probably have to put a caveat there. I don't think I'm able to give investment advice, but I think the space is a very interesting one. And speaking frankly, yes, interesting on many levels. I do think I was reading the news in the UK this morning that one of the political parties here might be cancelling its net zero by 2050 for the UK, and they're not the party in power. There's a lot of talk of that's maybe not do things or cancel targets. But I think more and more people, and certainly the younger generations, recognise we've got a massive challenge on our hands here. If we don't do anything, it's entirely unsustainable. There's going to be significant impact for our children, our grandchildren on this planet. We need to be taking some action. We probably need more government-driven or regulatory-led programs where there's a greater degree of compulsion, where programs are mandated and there's a greater degree of compliance on corporates to make sure that the action is taken. But in terms of investment, yes, I think it's a space that we need to attract greater investment into those as we get further up the quality curve, those projects become costlier and more difficult to implement. So that requires greater amounts of capital. It requires investors who are able to take a very long-term view. You look at some of those nature-based removal projects, and you're looking at a 10-year plus payback period, and that's not everyone's cup of tea from an investment perspective. When you're planting things, I have personal experience of this, not just in the garden but on a larger scale. You're looking at 4 to 5 years before you get a crop in many cases. If you're looking at agricultural, something like planting coffee, planting timber that's going to gradually remove carbon, well, it's a very long process. Setting up the nurseries, getting those plants out there on the scale that people are talking about, and we're already seeing a very, very large scale covering thousands of hectares at a time. It's a massive operation, and that takes a long time. Plants can fail. How do we track all of that? But broadly, yeah, I think it's certainly a space that it needs further investment, and if it needs further investment, then it needs to offer people a return to invest into that space. So yeah, I think it's a very attractive area, and I think the fact that the carbon market has been through some challenges over the last couple of years makes it a good time to be looking at it.
Definitely. And I think that interest in the subject is, I think that the way that we're talking about this is changing a lot. I see that, first of all, the interest in sustainability in general is much greater these days. It's an anecdote, but I think I believe in anecdotes most of the time. I bought a physical newspaper for a change last week, something that I hadn't done in, I don't know, years. And I could see maybe half of it was talking about sustainability or projects that are geared towards sustainability or anything that's resulting. Of course, I live in a very rural part of the country, so we generally talk a lot about, agriculture and stuff like that. But in the past, you wouldn't talk about sustainable agriculture as much. And of course, one of the reasons that I believe that we're talking about that is that we felt literally the result of not caring about sustainability last year. We had the biggest flood that we ever had in the state here in south of Brazil, which one of the reasons that scientists are saying that this happened was because the trees that were around the river were cut down and people just planted crops in there, and the trees didn't hold the water anymore. The crops were not as big to hold the water, and of course the water level rose way too much, way more than was expected. Now, with that, I think that the way that we're talking about things is changing a little bit. So in the past, and correct me if I'm wrong, in the past, I had the impression that whenever we talked about sustainability, environmental action, and anything like that, it was cute. We were talking about, oh yeah, that's so cute, he's trying to save the world. That's the kind of thing that young people want to do, and that's cool. They will grow out of it. Now I think that the way that we're talking about things is not like that anymore. It's still it's still changing, and becoming something a little bit different. But my question for you is, from the corporate side, where is this demand coming from? Are they actually buying carbon credits because they are interested in the environmental impacts? They want to do the right thing, and they know that they want to just compensate for their emissions because it's the right thing to do? Or do they have other interests behind it? What are the motivations for a company to look at compensation strategies?
It's a very good question, Pedro. I think the first thing to say is that the bulk of the market that we're involved in is it's called the voluntary carbon market. Some people say it should be renamed the verified carbon market, but most of the action we are seeing is voluntary, and that is driven by corporates taking a decision internally that is what they should do, that they should offset those emissions they're not otherwise able to abate or avoid. They might like to do that by having a more basic project, or they might like to get involved in a project that has perhaps more social and broader community impact at the same time. Those decisions are typically led by the interests of a number of stakeholders in the business, whether that be the shareholders, investors, employees, the leadership of that organization. I think that many companies see that still is important. I know that ESG as a segment is somewhat under question today as to you read headlines of ESG is dead, it's no longer important. But I think it's very important. Sure, you may not have the budget for it at the moment. It might not be a priority. But if we forget about the environment, sustainability, governance issues, then that poses a very great risk for us going forward. We too in the UK have the weather here has become increasingly unpredictable. We are subject to floods on a fairly regular basis in different parts of the country now, and I think more so than at any time in the past. While people notice that and often say last year was the hottest summer on record in the UK, people also quickly forget and perhaps aren't taking it into their day-to-day lives. So we still need to do more at a higher level to keep this at the forefront of people's minds. I do think that there needs to be more top-down requirement on companies and businesses to be taking action. I don't know if I'm answering your question, if I've digressed somewhat, but I think that most corporates are coming into it with the right mindset. For sure, there are some who want to achieve. Yeah, we've offset something. It's not cost us a great deal. They perhaps won't make so much of a fuss about it, and perhaps won't publicise that so much. And that's strange. I don't really understand why anyone would do that. If you're going to offset your emissions, do so in a highly credible way that you can be proud of, and show to the world the impact that you are having through that, both in terms of the carbon that's either being avoided or being removed from the atmosphere, and potentially the other impacts of that project. And I think more and more corporates are seeing that. They are also seeing the big investors into those companies, pension funds, insurers, also looking at this, saying, "Yeah, that's what we want you to be doing." So I think there's a broadly, I still think we're on a positive trajectory. No doubt there'll be crosswinds that come from political change in different places from time to time. But we need to carry on in that way, and probably at a much, much greater pace, because as it stands, we're nowhere near keeping the global temperature rise within the limits that we're trying to achieve.
Definitely. But these decisions that are being taken by corporates, what are they motivated by? Do they have a bunch of annoying environmental employees that are pressing into this issue internally and they want to do it? Or do they see there's a marketing component to it which can help them change the company's image? Of course, each company is probably going to have a different reason to offset their emissions, but if you could share, of course, I understand that some of this information but might also not be something that I would like to make available for the public, but what are some of the reasons that they actually are interested in this internally?
There's, as you say, there's a very wide range of drivers behind the actions that a company may be taking. I do feel that a very good number want to be good corporate citizens, want to be seen to be doing the right thing. They do want to show to the world that we've set an objective for whichever year it is, let's say it's 2030, and we're en route to do that, to show to their stakeholders and to outside as well. So there's a communications aspect. They want to be visually, they want to be seen to be doing that. Yes, there are probably other cases where perhaps there are environmentally conscious employees who are encouraging that company to become more responsible. You see the growth of things like B Corps. We at SCB, we're also a B Corp. We take pride in being a socially responsible business, in providing certain opportunities for employees. For example, offering extensive and very good conditions for both for maternity and paternity and so forth. So I think there's I think that's a large part of what is driving it, without having a government or some overriding body saying this is what you have to do. Yes, companies are saying that it is a positive from a PR standpoint, but they're also looking at saying, well, we have emitted, let's say, 100,000 tons. How are we going to address that? Taking some pride in being able to say, look, we've been able to reduce emissions. We can show a trajectory of reducing our emissions. And for those emissions we can't, this is what we've done. And I think that's what most companies are driven by.
That's very interesting. It's not the answer that I was expecting, because I tend to think that people are very, especially corporations, are very they're interested in, of course, what they're interested in, which is profit or their businesses and all that. But at the same time, it makes sense, since the younger generations and which are about to become shareholders, and all the community around it are getting more concerned about these topics. It becomes interest of these corporations to also be concerned about it,
I'd say
right?
there is self-interest in that, is when they've got a product on the shelf competing with someone else's product next to it, and maybe that environmentally conscious person that's buying it says, well, I know this company is doing more about the environmental aspect than that one. I'm going to choose this product. And any little differentiating factor in very competitive marketplaces may help. Sure, ultimately, a lot of people might say, well, it's the price. I'm taking this one. It's 5p cheaper than the other one. But quite a lot of people take a different decision and might say, well, I'm willing to pay perhaps a small premium to have something that I believe is superior, where that company is perhaps doing something better. So I think that they are looking, for sure, a corporate is looking for an advantage. They're not looking to just give away money for this. They're saying, is it from a PR standpoint? Does that improve my standing in versus the competition in my space? I would say some clients of ours on the corporate side want to be seen as a leader on ESG issues and on sustainability issues in their particular sector, and they believe this is helping them to do that.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I think marketing explains that people are willing to pay premiums, especially the younger generation is more than willing to pay premium for differentiated products and products that align with their core beliefs. So that is very, very interesting. That makes a lot of sense for the voluntary market. But now I'd like to ask you about the other side of the market, which is what some call the compulsory carbon market. We've seen lots of pieces of legislation like CORSIA and Article 6 and this kind of legislation passing, and they're about to become active. What is your personal outlook? If you could, of course, maybe summarize for people that are listening, specifically maybe CORSIA, what it is and what kind of impact do you foresee specifically in the carbon market from these legislations?
For sure, Pedro. I think so. So taking CORSIA in particular, it's a very interesting development. So this is a compliance program that's been put in place by ICAO, that's the International Civil Aviation Organization, a UN body, which started with a pilot phase that's already happened. We're now into their first compliance phase, and this applies to international flights taken by most airlines around the world. There are certain exceptions for certain countries, particularly looking at LDCs. It's a very interesting, this together with Article 6 are the two topics that probably get everyone excited in the space, as this could be quite transformative. The CORSIA program, as I say, we're now into CORSIA phase 1. So this is a period where airlines need to offset the emissions that ICAO has stated what each airline has for that period through to 2027. They need to report by January 2028 on the action they've taken, and they will have needed to procure compliant credits. It's a very interesting model. CORSIA set out the registries which are approved under their scheme, and within that, certain project types which were eligible. Now, during the pilot phase, which ran until 2023, if I'm not mistaken, this gave a broader scope of projects. Now, for the first compliance period, which we're in now, the CORSIA's Technical Advisory Board decided in early December last year which methodologies would be allowed from different registries, and going to quite a high degree of granularity, and also creating a model that, if this is successful, could be potentially be replicated by other industry sectors or potentially other countries. We've seen a number of compliance schemes over the last few years from Singapore, Taiwan, South Africa, Colombia, Chile, just to give a few examples, who have incorporated credits from projects within the voluntary carbon space as part, or potentially having taking some role within those domestic compliance schemes. And I think similarly, we may see CORSIA, perhaps if it is successful. It's a work in progress in terms of what happens currently. So we have an interesting situation where there's something of a lack of available supply to those airlines today. The criteria for getting the CORSIA eligible tag within a registry is stringent. There are a lot of hurdles to be cleared in terms of each country having issued a project developer and a specific project with what's known as an LOA, a letter of authorization, allowing credits from that project to be used for this purpose and to be internationally transferred. Then for countries to have submitted to the UNFCCC what's known as a biennial transparency report, which elaborating on effectively demonstrating that the corresponding adjustment allowed by that LOA has actually been made. Each country have its own registry to record this, but then following COP last year in Baku, potentially there may be a centralized registry. There are a few still slightly unresolved issues as to how this is going to be managed. As it stands today, there are very few credits in projects that are compliant for this, but I think we will, over the course of this year, resolve that, and there will be greater availability for airlines. But this type of model becomes very interesting. It can support a number of those projects taking place on the ground. It can give us confidence in where the market goes, but there's still some work to be done to see how it all pans out in practice.
That makes perfect sense, and yeah, that's something that we're all looking forward to, and we're really excited to see what is going to come out of this.
If I could just add one last comment on that, Pedro, a number of the projects that SCB has been involved in financing are likely to be CORSIA eligible towards the end of the year. And going back to what I was saying earlier about the evolving methodologies, when CORSIA's Technical Advisory Board ruled on which should be allowed, it excluded certain methodologies and allowed others. And the projects that we've been involved in are in the process of being what's called re-quantified, which will result in a much lower number of credits being issued by them, but then will become CORSIA eligible. So it's an area that we have great involvement in, and I would say, like to think, some expertise in. We're working with a wide range of partners in the air industry, looking to assist them in that space. There's a lot of things up in the air with this as to how it's actually happening, and with political change in the US, some questioning whether will CORSIA happen. I think most people in the market, I think, believe that's not going to change anything. This is an international UN mandated program. There's a bit of a hiatus currently as everyone tries to work out what's the right thing to do. But ultimately, it creates, for the carbon market, it creates a fairly sizable market for particular project types, and that's fantastic. That can mean a lot of these projects can get implemented on the ground, have a market sell their credits into. And as I say, I think if this is successful and can potentially act as a model for further programs, then that's a very good thing.
Definitely. I completely agree with that. Well, Tom, I want to thank you so much for joining us today on the Green Earth podcast. I think this conversation was really, really insightful. Do you have any final words before we go?
No, just to say, Pedro, it's been a pleasure meeting you and speaking with you. Thank you very much for your time, and to your listeners' time. I hope some of what I had to say may have been useful. And thanks again for the invitation.
Thank you for joining us today. The Green Earth Podcast is a DGB Group initiative. DGB is a large-scale, nature-based project developer, and our goal is to help nature flourish and prosper. If you want to read more about our projects, please check our website, green.earth. The link is also in the description. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider leaving us a review. And if you know anyone that might benefit from this content, we'd greatly appreciate your recommendation. I'm Pedro Zimmer, your host, and I hope to see you for the next episode of the Green Earth Podcast.